Reflexes are rapid, pre-programmed, involuntary reactions to a stimulus, and they're a survival mechanism against potentially harmful stimuli. So it's important that you know the parts of a reflex. One part is the stimulus that's required to initiate the reflex. It's a rapid response that requires a few neurons involved, and there's minimal synaptic delay. So it's very, very rapid. It's a pre-programmed response that occurs the same way every time, and it's an involuntary response that ensures no intent or pre-awareness that's required. And essentially, what that means is there is no brain involvement. So these basic reflexes, especially, and there's reflexes that involve the brain, but the basic spinal reflexes are going to just involve the spinal cord. The complex or the components of a reflex arc are shown on this figure, and those parts of a reflex arc begin with a stimulus activating a sensory receptor, which is what we see at number one. Number two is that the nerve impulse travels through a sensory neuron to the central nervous system. And three would be that there's interneurons processing information about the stimulus. Number four is there's a motor neuron that sends impulses to the effector. And then five would be that the effector, which is a muscle or a gland, is going to respond to the impulse from the motor neuron. So let's look a little more closely at this diagram. Number one is going to be where there is a stimulus that activates a sensory receptor. Could be a receptor that's in the skin, could be a pain receptor, a temperature receptor, a tactile receptor, all kinds of different receptors. But that initiates a signal which travels through a spinal nerve, specifically the sensory part of the spinal nerve. And the sensory neuron, remember, conducts an afferent signal, which means that it goes towards the central nervous system. The next part of this reflex arc is an integration center where there are interneurons. And the interneurons are located in the gray matter of the spinal cord. They make decisions on what's going to then travel towards the effector. In this case, there's a motor neuron that transmits that nerve impulse to the effector. And so this would be the efferent pathway, which means that it goes away from the central nervous system to the effector. And that effector in this case is a muscle, but it could also be a gland. So the components of a reflex arc could either involve just one side of the body or the other side of the body. If they involve only one side of the body, the term we use for that is ipsilateral, and that means that both the receptor and the effector are on the same side. So the example that we just saw, everything is located on the same side, so that would be an ipsilateral reflex. If, however, the effector was on the other side of the spinal cord, it would be called a contralateral reflex. And a contralateral reflex means that impulses initiating from a receptor cross the spinal cord to activate an effector organ on the opposite limb. An example of this may be what's called the crossed extensor reflex. And in this case, there's usually a limb that is withdrawn on one side of the spinal cord, but then there is a limb that is extended on the contralateral side of the spinal cord. Reflexes also may or may not involve many interneurons. If they're monosynaptic, this is the simplest type of reflex arc. The sensory axons are going to synapse directly on the motor neurons. However, the more complex pathways are going to be what's called polysynaptic. So they involve interneurons within the reflex arc. This slide is showing monosynaptic and polysynaptic reflexes. In the example of the monosynaptic reflex, we see the sensory receptor, the signal traveling to the central nervous system via a sensory neuron, the interneuron in the spinal cord, followed by a motor neuron, which is taking that information back out to an effector organ, which is on the ipsilateral side. In the example of another reflex, this one's a bit more complicated just because it has an interneuron. So therefore, it's called a polysynaptic reflex. The sensory receptor is activated, sending a signal in towards the spinal cord via a sensory neuron. We see that signal traveling in through the sensory neuron to the gray matter, where the interneuron is located, activating a motor neuron, which travels back out to the effector organ. This is also ipsilateral. However, if the information were to cross over to the opposite side, then it would be called a contralateral reflex. Examples of spinal reflexes are on this slide. A very common one is called the withdrawal or flexor reflex. It's a polysynaptic reflex because it uses an interneuron. It's usually initiated by a painful stimulus, like stepping on a piece of glass. When you step on a piece of glass, that's going to initiate a reflex that causes you to withdraw that foot, that toe, which stepped on the piece of glass. So the sensory information is transmitted to the spinal cord. Interneurons receive that information and stimulate motor neurons, which direct flexor muscles to contract in response. At the same time, there's going to be antagonistic extensor muscles inhibited so that the traumatized body may be quickly withdrawn. If this happens so that it uses extensor muscles on the opposite side of the body, then it would be a contralateral reflex.